I think that we have an epidemic of darkness deficiency. I mean, you look at this planet from afar and it's like, even at night, it's lit up, it's bright. We see that ecosystems are becoming disturbed and distorted. And I do think, I've been saying this now for a while, but artificial blue light is one of the most societally accepted endocrine disruptors. Everybody knows that plastics are bad. People know that heavy metals and mercury are bad, amalgams, and, we can rattle off a list of just intuitively knowing that things are bad. But most people embrace the light. They're afraid of the darkness. They don't want to be in darkness.
Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing. Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death. My name is Victoria Lafont.
I'm Hannah Wright, and today our podcast guest is Dr. Deanna Minich. We're so excited to have you here.
Good to be here with both of you.
Yeah. So as is the tradition on Influence to Death, Dr. Minich has been like, do not read my bio. So we're gonna, it's like every person we interview that we're like, gosh, this person has this like amazing background and like that. They're always like, do not read my bio. Let's just get into it. So today we are gonna talk about melatonin, and I'll just say, we kind of have this format with the podcast. We kind of talk about the history of the topic, and then we talk about our bias, where we stand, and then we go through the research, and then we give people a takeaway. I love melatonin so much that at the very beginning, I just want to say it is the compound of my heart. That's how I feel.
Really? I did not know that about you.
Yeah, I love melatonin. And I don't know how it actually started. Maybe in like redox sciences, learning more about redox and being really captivated by that. I'm jumping the gun a little by saying that, but I'll just put it out there.
That's interesting. Yes, it's good to have a biochemical love, for sure.
Yeah, anything to get you through learning those pathways.
Whatever it is, we need to have an emotional connection to our physiology, right?
Yeah, yes. It seems like that's actually very important in healing. So kind of the reason that we asked Dr. Minich to, and is it, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. Is it Dr. Minich or Dr. Minich?
Minich. You've got it.
Okay, I said it wrong.
Yeah, it's like Munich. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And you asked us to call you Deanna, which I will
just call me Deanna. It makes it easier.
Get used to. So you have recently published a paper, very comprehensive paper on melatonin. But also, Hannah, I think probably you've experienced this too. We get a lot of questions about melatonin, and I feel like there are a lot of opinions out there about melatonin. So, I don't want it to be like, oh, we're going to bust myths, but I do want to review some of the questions that we get or that I have about melatonin, and then maybe talk about your paper. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Deanna, do you want to talk about the history a little bit, or what you've learned while you've been researching melatonin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me just give the viewers or the listeners a little bit of background as to how I got into this, because most people know me for phytonutrients and eating the rainbow. Yeah. So it's kind of like, well, how does melatonin fit into all of this? And I would say that two things happened for me within the past 5 years. One was I first started to hear much more about melatonin as we went through the pandemic, and we heard about people taking it together with vitamin D and vitamin C, and was kind of thinking, what? How does that fit into the immune system? So that was kind of the first inclination as I started to read the papers. And I actually wrote a paper with Dr. Hanaway, and we were looking at nutrients for the immune system. So I kind of stumbled across it then. And then later on became the chief science officer at Symphony Natural Health, which is an awesome company. It's like one of those best kept secrets where they only have like 7 products and they have science on these products, but they've been so quiet and they've been around forever. And so I feel like, they just redid their website and all of that. And so I started to learn about plant melatonin. So the way I got into it was from that angle. And as I started to do research on it historically, there is a person in the field to follow. It is Dr. Russell Ryder, who, Victoria, you probably are aware of him if you love melatonin, because In my view, he's like the father of melatonin. If Jeff Bland is the father of functional medicine, Russell Ryder, PhD, is the father of melatonin. He wrote a book about melatonin, a consumer book about melatonin in the 1990s. Like, he was so ahead of his time. But historically speaking, the way that it came about was it was actually discovered by a dermatologist from Yale. So this dermatologist's name is Aaron Lerner, and Dr. Aaron Lerner was looking for a skin lightening agent and stumbled across some early 19, I think it was published in 1917, this literature around putting the pineal gland into a vat of frogs and noting that the frogs became whiter in color. And then he kind of got on this path of looking into, well, what was that substance? That molecule was then coined by him as mela, which refers to the skin, the melanin, tonin, because the chemical structure looks similar to serotonin. So melatonin was identified in 1958. Then people started to look into the pineal gland. The pineal gland became much more, it's kind of interesting to me because you would think that there was a lot on the pineal gland before this time. Like Rene Descartes in the 15th, 16th centuries had identified the pineal gland as the seat of the soul, but we really didn't know much from a biology perspective about the pineal gland, I would say, until after this discovery of melatonin. So then there was some more work on the pineal gland. Dr. Russell Ryder had been working on melatonin since 1961. He had a postdoc and other people in his lab working on it that really brought a lot of the science of melatonin to light, so to speak, which is interesting because it plays a role in circadian rhythm.
It's a good pun. Oh, I got it.
Yeah. Even though actually melatonin is much more about the darkness than it is about the light. So I would say, we're kind of relatively new to the science of melatonin. But what is really fascinating is that melatonin is not new. It's actually very ancient. And it's been referred to as an ancient molecule because it's been around. I mean, it is in all life forms. So if you look at plants, it's a growth factor in plants. In fact, if you look at some of the earlier studies, you'll see that melatonin was sprayed on crops to help them grow better. It's a growth factor.
Oh, wow.
It helps the plants to make more phytochemicals. And plants don't have a pineal gland, right? So we find it in plants. It's obviously in animals. And in fact, that was one of the first ways that melatonin was isolated, was through the pineal gland of animals. And you can only imagine how many animals you would need in order to get appreciable amounts of that melatonin, which is just produced in picograms. I mean, we're talking like minute amounts.
Yeah.
So on the horizon of the melatonin industry, and even looking at supplements, what people started to do was chemically synthesize it. Right. So they would synthesize it from organic compounds, like certain petrochemical based compounds, run it through a series of reactions to get the melatonin molecule. And so, 99% of the melatonin on the market is chemically synthesized, which draws me even further into plants that, the plant melatonin. If I get to choose, am I going to use an animal derived melatonin from the pineal gland, which is not really done so much anymore because, it tends not to be safe because of prions and viruses.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's scary to think about.
Yeah.
Prions are, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just was like, whoa.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that, that is not in the industry typically done anymore.
Okay.
But what we're now learning is, most people think of melatonin as something for sleep, and that it's a sleep hormone, and they kind of pigeonhole it in that way. But much like phytonutrients, melatonin is pleiotropic, right? It has many different functions. It does a lot of different things in nature. It's a primordial molecule of, I would say, even connecting all of us through the mitochondria. So to me, I often think of melatonin as maternal, mitochondrial. It's like all the M's. It's not really so much about sleep for me, based on what we know. It opens the gate for sleep, because of its hypothermic action, and also
Mhm.
because it's signaling the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is telling the pineal gland to start to make melatonin to set the circadian clock and the signal. Now that's relevant, right? And that tends to be tied with sleep, but really melatonin is much more about circadian signaling, more than anything else, and also the mitochondrial action, the redox potential that you spoke of, Victoria.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
So yeah,
redox for listeners, that's kind of talking about the antioxidant potential of melatonin
yeah.
is what redox, I guess. Is that the best, simplest way to say it for someone who's
Yeah,
not
and
familiar with
we'll
redox
get it.
pathway?
Definitely. Antioxidant, in my view, in some ways, is kind of a 1990s word. We used it so much in reference to plants. It basically scoops up, quenches a lot of the free radicals, kind of what makes us go rancid as human beings and makes us age, right? So the mitochondria is producing a lot of free radicals through metabolism. And what melatonin and other antioxidants are able to do is just kind of scoop them up and make them less charged so that they're not as reactive. And we can talk about why melatonin is unique in its antioxidant activity, why it's not like vitamin C, it's not like vitamin E, and it is
Mhm.
even a precursor to glutathione, which is
Mhm.
often seen as a master antioxidant. So it's really supercharged. And that doesn't mean that you only need melatonin. You know, nature likes diversity, nature likes
Mhm.
redundancy. And
Mhm.
so melatonin plays really well with a series of other antioxidants and antioxidant defense enzymes as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that aspect of I think doesn't redox stands like the science, it's like oxidation reduction science. But yeah, people usually think of it as like when we eat berries, we get antioxidants. But the mechanism of how that works, we've talked about a little bit because we've done episodes on the carnivore diet
Yep.
and that trend where
Mhm.
people are like, oh, plants are poisonous. And we're like, yes, that's true. I mean, there's all kinds of like connotations of that word. But like what they don't say is that that little bit of stress that plants put on us actually elicits this response in humans. Like the response to that stress is so beneficial that we have great health effects from that. Same thing with exercise. Like there's
Yeah.
so many compounds that create that. And so when you're talking about like how melatonin is different from vitamin C or how it's different, from these other antioxidants, the question that comes up for me is like, does it work in the same way that they do? They kind of basically turn into like signaling molecules once they come into a contact with a free radical, or is melatonin like a true antioxidant, like it kind of just takes care of it, not as much of a signaler, or maybe it's both?
Yeah, actually, there are primary, secondary, and tertiary antioxidants. So, does it get right in there and just take care of it? Yes. Does it deal with the byproducts of that reaction? Yes. And what's really unique is that melatonin and its metabolites act as antioxidants. So, one
Mm-hmm.
molecule of melatonin can quench up to 10 different types of free radicals,
Mm-hmm.
whereas something like vitamin C can scoop up like one to two. And, again, glutathione is pretty potent, but melatonin can actually potentiate glutathione in the body, glutathione activity. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, melatonin works in a primary, secondary, tertiary role as it relates to antioxidants. So, it deals with the free radical straight on as well as the byproducts and helps to provide an antioxidant defense, kind of there bolstering the system. And what
Mm-hmm.
you spoke to, I just want to mention this real quick because it's so interesting when I hear people say plants are toxic. Because just like you said, what we want is that little bit of stress, which we call xenohormesis, and that is actually healthy stress, and that translates into cellular resilience. And it's interesting because if you take raw plants or raw meat, you're still going to have some degree of toxins, whether
Yeah.
it may be in a different form in the raw meat. You might have microbes, you might have parasites, you could have worms, you could have all different. And then when you cook the meat, you can have advanced glycation end products, heterocyclic amines. So it's really interesting in our society how there's often the tendency to categorize something as good or bad, or just even healthy or unhealthy. And to me, life is a spectrum. There are many shades of the rainbow in between the black and the white. And so I think it's a lot of nuance. We need like a podcast like yours that goes into nuance, not like yes or no, good or bad polarity. It's like, no, there's a spectrum here that we need to consider. We need to be thoughtful and think through it rather than just in our mind thinking good, bad, don't eat plants or don't eat meat. It's like, no, you've got to look at the person, how the food is prepared. And what is the toxin anyway? When people say that plants have toxins, it's like, what? I just feel like a lot of these catchphrases get thrown out there without really truly understanding what we're talking about. And I'm saying that not what you just said. You're reflecting what we hear out in the ethers of whether social media and catchphrases. So yeah, we don't
memed medicine.
Yes. And we need nuanced nutrition for sure.
That's why we're called Influence to Death.
I know.
Yeah, that's kind of.
I could say that to both of you.
This is the conversation that we come back to over and over. Like Hannah and I are like looking at each other as you're talking. And I'm like, I don't know if you've met her or heard of her, but Dr. Sharon Bergquist was on the podcast earlier this month, and her entire work is around like the small hormetic stressors that can lead to resilience. And she's fabulous. Like, I'm like, you all might even be friends, so I'm like, I'm going to send you her email address. But that topic it's like such a great practical example of why it is so important to get down to the nuance, because things aren't always what they seem. There are these spectrums. Like there's that guy, Graham Rook, I think is his name. He has the old friends hypothesis.
Oh, yep.
And that like ties into what you're saying, like a kind of like, hey, like, yeah, there are some exposures that you want to avoid, like, forever chemicals and like that. But like we evolved with parasites and these different microbes, and there are, kind of like amounts that can be detrimental, but we can see a lot of things happening with humans that might not be great when we completely eradicate that. In a lot of circles, it's like, there's a lot of parasite cleanses out there. I'll just leave it at that. And you're talking to somebody who used to eat the primal diet, so very familiar with raw meat. Okay, that was an awesome history. Hannah, do you have anything that you want to ask?
Oh, I am so fascinated by melatonin. I guess I can add my bias really quick, is that I'm pretty pro melatonin, but my understanding has like obviously changed as I've learned more and more. Before I studied nutrition, I was probably similar to a lot of people where you're a little nervous about taking melatonin because you're afraid it's going to affect your own production. And my only association was with sleep. I knew it was a sleep aid, and I thought, well, I don't need a sleep aid, and I don't want it to mess up my own sleep regulation. And then I started learning about its role in digestive health and started using it. After I studied nutrition and, started seeing clients, I started using it for people with GERD, and just would see this incredible benefit for that. And now reading the paper you just published, it's incredible. Like all of the applications, how it plays a role in everything. It's just mind blowing. And like you said, it's new. Like there's so much we have to learn. And I think it is such an important sacred molecule for the body. It's so critical to our health in so many ways. Personally, I had insomnia and I did take synthetic. I didn't know that phytomelatonin was as effective. Actually, now I'm learning from reading your writing, potentially more effective than synthetic. But the synthetic melatonin saved me. I mean, I was like had severe insomnia and it saved me. And now I don't take it anymore, but now I'm thinking maybe I should be taking it just for all these other incredible benefits that don't have to do with sleep. And I just wanted to share that point as far as that pro bias, very strong pro bias that I have.
Yeah.
But there's a reason you have a pro bias, because you've seen it work and you've gone into the weeds a little bit to understand it. And I do think that when you look at social media, just as another example, people seem to be either pro or anti. And have really strong views on melatonin for some reason, which is really interesting to me. And often when I look at what they say, if they're against melatonin, It's because it's been pigeonholed. Like they don't
Mhm.
actually know the breadth of the science. They're just looking at it as a neurohormone related to sleep and then applying the concept of hormone, thinking if I take melatonin, I'm going to stop my body's own production because that's
Mhm.
how all the other hormones work. But
Mhm.
melatonin is much like vitamin D. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin. It serves the purpose of being a vital amine in some ways or a vital compound, but it actually works like a hormone and it does a lot of different things as well, much like melatonin. In fact, I have applied this terminology to both vitamin D and melatonin. I call them circadian nutrients
Mm.
because I do think you need both of them. Both of them are essential. And as we get older, typically they both decline and we start to see changes in the immune system. We see changes in mitochondrial function. Neurodegenerative conditions
Mhm.
start to increase. And we see that melatonin and vitamin D to me are kind of like brother and sister. Vitamin
Mhm.
D is like the biologic sun or light sensor. And we all got really into light, right? We started to slowly feel the gravitational pull of vitamin D over all of these years. Look how long that took.
Yeah.
So now we get it. It's like, yes, sunlight is important. Let's reevaluate our relationship with the sun. And
Mhm.
maybe we need supplemental vitamin D. Maybe we need to get our vitamin D levels tested. I
Mhm.
think we're really smart about vitamin D now to more or less a better extent than we have been. But
Aware.
what we're not so good about though is understanding darkness and
Mhm.
understanding melatonin and understanding circadian rhythm and also understanding the connection to the mitochondria and the brain. So
Mhm.
melatonin to me is well, we can go into all the different functions. I don't want to wax too philosophically yet, but all of this study on melatonin has actually led me into actually a more spiritual or even a philosophical take on
Mhm.
melatonin because it is ancient, because it has been with us throughout time. And also because if you look at the biochemical compounds, tryptophan is the essential amino acid that then leads to serotonin.
Mhm.
Serotonin then leads to melatonin. And in many ways, and then we see melatonin being connected to other tryptamines that are formed through the pineal gland,
Mhm.
which may play a role in consciousness,
Mhm.
in dream
Mhm.
states, right? So is it a quantum molecule of our actual conscious aware state as well as our unconscious subconscious? Is it a divining rod between reality and dreams? Because when
Mhm.
people take melatonin, many times their sleep cycles change, their
Yeah.
REM starts to change, their different phases of sleep, and they start to have dreams where they
Yeah.
hadn't been dreaming before.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's just led me down a rabbit hole, and I've been starting to talk more about the science and the spirituality of melatonin because I do
Mhm.
think that there's a biochemical basis for conscious awareness
Mm-hmm.
and different states. Like if people meditate versus people who don't meditate, and this is looking at, there was a study of long-term meditators. We're talking like they've been meditating over 10 years. They just naturally had higher levels of melatonin versus
Wow.
people who were not meditating.
Ooh.
So I don't
Interesting.
know. Is it one of
Yeah.
those molecules of consciousness? Serotonin, the happy, content molecule. And then we have
Mhm.
melatonin, which is further on into kind of the reaches of our other knowing,
Mhm.
our other senses,
Yeah.
perhaps. So that's where this whole biochemical venture has taken me into thinking about it very deeply.
And then we have DMT, which is also made by the pineal gland, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes, it doesn't come from melatonin, but it's in the same family. They're all tryptamines. And so they
Okay.
all have a very similar structure. And if you look at tryptophan, tryptophan is kind of unusual from some of the other amino acids in the way that, it's got this benzene ring that seems to carry photons and electrons a bit
Hmm.
better than some other structures. And so, does it use that to quench the free radicals and also to transfer light through the brain, the photonic signals that might be related to states of consciousness. So I'm actually doing a talk on this. I've never given a talk on this before, but I started to look through the literature and really dug through like some of the early work on tryptophan, because tryptophan on its own is a very unique, again, amino acid that serves a lot of purposes in the body. And so, yeah, I just think that there's something here that we're going to uncover as it relates to conscious awareness, and perhaps melatonin is one of those gateways.
Oh,
It's
that's so
so you,
exciting.
Dr.
Now,
Minich. It's so cool. It actually, like, it reminds me years ago, our friends in California, I've been friends with this group of kooks for like, 20 years now. They all really got into the dark retreats. And so, there would be
Yes.
places you could go and they would like take care of you, but they were like, no, 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 we got this. And so they duct taped light-proof tarp, like light-proof plastic, like all around this one room in their house. And they had like, I mean, you're in pitch black dark for, like 72, like 3 days to 6 days. I mean, it's a long time. You're like completely dark. So there's like a poop bucket where they like help each other out. And they would like slide food under the door. It was like this whole thing. But they definitely came out and they were like, you start to see light sparks. And, I think it stimulates DMT production in, you say pineal, is that the right way to say
Pineal,
it?
yeah.
Okay. I often come up against I'm reading and I've been saying pineal to myself for,
Some people do say
15
it
years,
that way, but I've heard it both ways. So you can say either.
Yes,
that's wild. So I've spent some time in float tanks and in that darkness, I would see light, like flickers of light. And I'd be like, where is it come? Like, is there a hole in this? Like, where is the light coming from? And I think I don't know what it was, but it's definitely, I've experienced that. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I'm glad that you actually brought that up, because you're right. It has been kind of trending for a while, these darkness retreats. And when you see people that come out of those retreats, they take the mask off, because not only are they in the darkness, they wear a mask, like they are really in darkness. So they're producing abundant melatonin. There's no doubt. Right. So when they come out of that, it's a very emotional experience. And typically they have this hyper feel of their reality. So colors are brighter and more vivid, like their senses are sharper. I mean, that could just be from just sheer sensory withdrawal. But if you think of the ancient rishis and monks that would go into caves and this solitude, this darkness, like that void of darkness and leading to something much more profound, like it really encourages us to go on the inside. And I think that we have an epidemic of darkness deficiency. I mean, you look at this planet from afar and it's like, even at night, it's lit up, it's bright. We see that ecosystems are becoming disturbed and distorted. Reproductive patterns of animals are changing. And I do think, I've been saying this now for a while, but artificial blue light is one of the most societally accepted endocrine disruptors. Everybody knows that plastics are bad. People know that heavy metals and mercury are bad, amalgams, and, we can rattle off a list of just intuitively knowing that things are bad. But most people embrace the light. They're afraid of the darkness. They don't want to be in darkness, even if it's electric, fluorescent, flickering light. It's like, that is the worst for us. When it's dark outside, we really need to be in darkness. And if you look at a lot of indigenous peoples and just how they live without electricity, and I had the opportunity to talk with a neuroscientist at the University of Washington who went to South America to live with a group like this. And it was like, okay, when it's dark, you go to bed, you go to sleep. When it's light, you wake up. Like, you actually mirror your sleeping and your waking with nature. You don't artificially distort that.
Right.
Oh my God, in Boston. You guys, I'm going to be in bed at like 5 o'clock at night.
Well, you just start to like bring things down, right? You kind of go from the yang into the yin. And you just change your eating behavior, not having so much food at night. And that makes sense as well, right? If you look at Dr. Sachin Panda's work, which I just think is phenomenal, right? The circadian code. He has spent his life researching circadian rhythm. A lot of things go out of whack when we are not in harmony with light and darkness. And you start to deplete your melatonin because you're living amongst the light and you can't produce that from the pineal gland. And that actually leads to accelerated aging. You know, Dr. Russell Ryder reported on in his book some of these studies in animals where they put melatonin in the drinking water of animals versus not, just regular water. And the animals that had the melatonin actually didn't age like the ones that didn't have melatonin, right? So
Cool.
all this light, it's aging our skin, it's aging us on the inside. So maybe that's kind of what people need to hear, is that artificial blue light, it's leading us faster into accelerated chronic diseases of aging.
Yeah, I have a question, and I'm curious what you think about this. I don't know if there's a way to know this for sure, but as you age, your melatonin production goes down. You know, like babies and kids, they have the highest production. They're sleeping the most, and I think it's common for, like, as you age, you require less sleep. And it's true, right, that the pineal gland starts to calcify as you age. Do
True.
you think that that's a product of our modern lifestyle, or if that's a natural process of aging and has some type of benefit as you age? I mean, there's no way to know that, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I have heard that centenarians tend to have higher levels of melatonin. And so is it an artifact of aging? Is it protective? I would say we don't know anything else. We don't have a person who is high in all of their hormones to 120 years of age. And then we can look at those things. We can only look kind of at population-based patterns. But I do think we want to preserve melatonin. I think we're depleting our reserve of melatonin quicker with age. Just like you said, children have the highest levels of endogenous melatonin, and yet they're the ones being given all the melatonin gummies and the chewables. And, you know, that to me is not needed and not necessary. I think that children need good sleep hygiene, good habits to foster good, healthy sleep and to keep them sleeping, get off the devices, the technology. I think that that's more of a lifestyle thing. But I do think that as we get older into middle age and into, by the time we're in our 50s, goodness, we're at like 10% of what we produced as a teenager on average, right? And when do people start to have sleep issues? We could say it's around menopause for women, which is usually in the early 50s or late 40s. So everything starts to kind of consolidate. We start to see low estrogens. We see low progesterone, low testosterone, changes with cortisol all over the place, low melatonin. So it's not like it's just low melatonin. It would be that there's a web of hormones, of which melatonin is also a neurohormone in conjunction with all of its other functions. But yeah, it goes down with the rest. And hormones in many ways impart vitality, impart resilience, help the mitochondria to function better, give us more energy, ATP, better wound healing, right? So when we lose that melatonin, it's part of, I think, the aging process for sure.
That's a great question, Hannah. I would never even have thought of that.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting to think about it that way. And I don't know, I'm always curious about that kind of stuff. I'm also curious about what you think about kids supplementing melatonin, because that is a big thing. And I didn't learn about it until I became a parent, and hearing other parents say, like, oh, just give them some melatonin. And I'm like, what? Is that a good idea?
We used to get Benadryl.
Oh my God.
That's how we got put to sleep.
True. You know, for the most part, without knowing the child or its the child's health history and health status, I would say it's not really the best thing. So we start to make more melatonin as, you know, after a child is born, between 3 months to about 12 months, that melatonin production ramps up. And if you think of it, it's kind of connected to the gut brain axis and starting to see
Yeah.
the full growth of the brain within that first year of life. And then that could be accelerated if a woman is nursing her infant and nursing in the evening when her melatonin is high, because
Right.
melatonin is lipophilic, so it would be in breast milk, and you don't have infant formula with melatonin added.
Right.
So your ramp up process as an infant into being a child, it could be faster if you're actually breastfed, right? And the woman is strategic with nursing in the evening hours. And in fact, it's been thought that early life melatonin can help with colic, and it can also help with forming the gut microbiome. That's
Right.
that's
That
been
was a cool part of your paper.
yeah. I mean, that's been mostly done in animals, but there are certain researchers that are focused just in this area of prenatal care and looking at the role of melatonin because of its role in the gut. Hannah, I really like what you said about GERD because it's true. I mean, so the way I look at it is you have pineal melatonin, which is related to the pineal gland, which is related to circadian rhythm, and that only expresses in darkness. So at 2 a.m., between 2 and 4 a.m., you have this spike of melatonin, and then it goes down. Like for the rest of the day, you've got nothing. If you were to take a blood sample or a urine sample, you're not going to find anything for the most part. But the gut produces a lot of melatonin, and that's called extrapineal melatonin, meaning that it's non-pineal, it's not stimulated by darkness. It's thought to be stimulated through just the act of eating. Perhaps it's an act of protection from a lot of the metabolic activity from the food.
Oh,
Yeah. I
whoa.
know.
That's
That's when you were
so
starting to say it, I was
cool. Oh
like,
my God. That's so cool. Oh my
yeah.
God. Sorry.
And also, I want to speak to the GERD because even though I don't think we completely understand why melatonin is made in the gut, it seems to be more of an autocrine and paracrine function than a true endocrine function. So, in other words, it kind of stays locally where it's produced throughout the tract, the whole tract. They have found, researchers have found melatonin throughout the entire GI tract. And it's thought that it might be connected to motility. So when you
Yeah.
say GERD, when I'm thinking of gastroparesis, when I'm thinking of healthy, just motility of in movement through the gut, perhaps melatonin is playing a role in that.
And
Mm-hmm.
when we say GERD, I mean, kind of like the symptom that people experience is heartburn most
Yeah.
often. So
Not
when
the
we talk
reflux.
about that,
Yeah.
like people are like, what? Yeah, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Is that right for
Yeah.
GERD? Yeah, I mean, that was maybe the coolest takeaway that I got learning about the digestive process was how melatonin, it like acts on every mechanism of why people have GERD. Like it like tightens the lower esophageal sphincter and like is, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like antioxidative in that area. It kind of like puts out the fire. And actually that, okay, so that's why melatonin for me is like the molecule of my heart or whatever, is because my dad had AFib. And I
Ah.
remember his doctor was like, "Oh, we need to put you on omeprazole after
Mhm.
we ablate." He had ablation
Mhm.
surgery and it was
Mhm.
successful and he's doing great. Yesterday was actually his 75th birthday, so happy
Oh,
birthday, Dad.
nice. Happy
Yes, doing
birthday.
really, really well. But I was like, why are they putting you on, you know, this acid suppressing drug? And I just remember, like, I actually remember exactly where I was standing, like having this conversation with him. I was like, I have to look in the research literature to see, like what's the deal with that? And then learning, like, oh yeah, if someone has heartburn, the esophagus runs right next to the heart where those cells are that they ablate. And so they don't want the oxidative stress and all kinds
Mhm.
of other mechanisms of that acid reflux to affect. And I think
Oh,
even Deanna,
wow.
I've sent you this paper that I wrote about this to be like, hey, could I get
Yeah.
this published? You were super supportive. But anyway, so they're like, they want to make sure that there's no heartburn up into that area to mess with the work that they've done on those cells. And it set me off on this total journey into like AFib, GERD, melatonin, all the drugs they use to address AFib, which can be like impactful on our body's own ability to produce melatonin, like beta blockers.
Yeah.
And that I like just got super, super into melatonin through that direction. And wrote a paper on it. So,
I
and
didn't know you
actually,
wrote a paper on it. I have to read it.
it's the nerdiest shit, Hannah.
I would love to read it.
It's so nerdy, but I read so much about melatonin in that paper, and now he takes herbatonin as the melatonin
Cool.
because, and this is actually, I'm going to segue myself.
Okay.
So, this is actually one of the main questions that I have is like, it seems like melatonin affects certain people in very different ways.
Yes.
And after reading your paper, I was kind of like, ooh, I have a guess about why that might happen. But like, both of my parents actually are great sleepers. When they take melatonin, synthetic melatonin, it keeps them like asleep all day. Like they can never get awake. But then other people that I've talked to, like actually my husband's mom, she's like, I can't take that because it wakes me up. So like people have these different effects. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
I do. A couple of things. First of all, for the people that get groggy from melatonin, where they're kind of somnolent after when they should be awake. So, melatonin is metabolized primarily by cytochrome 1A2, which is the same enzyme system as caffeine. So, people can have variability in how that enzyme performs. Some people are really fast metabolizers of caffeine and run that quickly through, so they don't get affected by coffee. I actually am one of those people.
Wow.
So I don't have an issue with melatonin as long as I take it pretty close into bedtime, right? Because it could run through and then kind of be exhausted early, and that might allow for somebody to wake up. But I have another idea around that. But for other people, if they're slow metabolizers, like my husband is like that, he gets groggy from melatonin, so he needs to take it a couple of hours before bedtime, like 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, when the normal directions for use would be to take it 40 to 60 minutes before bedtime. So his body needs a little bit more time to process the melatonin, to run it through, to sync up with his sleep cycle. So that could be one way around it. A couple of other things. Now, just a couple of things about format, because if somebody is taking a melatonin that contains other things, those things actually be impacting its metabolism or its entry into the body. So many times I'll see melatonin with other herbs. Those herbs could potentially change the metabolism of melatonin. So you want to be sure that the format is pure. One of the things I do like about herbatonin is that it's a plant matrix. So it's kind of bound up in the plant, is what I would, you've got other things in there. You've got lutein, you've got different essential amino acids and fatty acids, like small amounts. You've got chlorophyll. So it's kind of bound up. It's not just right there for the taking. So it's a bit more of a natural sustained release, which I think can work better for people. Some people like to take their melatonin with a little bit of like fish oil to delay the uptake and kind of the movement into the body through the night. The other reason for somebody waking up in the middle of the night after taking melatonin could also be because melatonin will change the REM cycle a bit. It can modify some of the sleep phases. And as we get older, sometimes those sleep phases, we feel the transition or the handoff from one phase to the other, like it's not as seamless as it should be. And sometimes with melatonin, because we're altering one of the phases a bit, we can start to feel that bumpiness. I also think it could be related to brain detoxification, because one of the things that we see is that melatonin plays a role in the lymphatic fluid flux. That the takeaway for that is that just like when you're sleeping, your brain has the ability to get rid of a lot of toxic metabolites. Like your brain has to wash itself, right? Dr. Russell Ryder calls this brainwashing, but in a good way. It's like you have to somehow clean the brain, but you can't do it when you're thinking and you're talking and you're active. So you do it when you're sleeping. And what's also high when you're sleeping? Melatonin. So what we see in a lot of the literature is that melatonin is a neurotrophic factor. It seems to be very neuroprotective, helps with neuronal plasticity. And at least in preclinical studies, which is the easier way to look at this, we see that melatonin is playing a role in the transport of metabolites from the brain through that lymphatic fluid flux. So let's imagine that somebody has a lot of metabolites in their brain. They might have increased toxin load. They might experience a little bit of disruption or a little bit of wake up, perhaps because of a lot of this brain liver access. And in fact, if you look at traditional Chinese medicine chronotherapy, between 1 and 3 is liver time. And that is also when melatonin is peaking, right? So it's a detoxification time of night. So what I would say is if somebody starts to wake up after taking melatonin, to me, I kind of see that as a detoxifying reaction. If they were to continue with it and keep it going, it's almost, and again, this isn't scientifically said this way, but this is me putting a lot of the dots together from what I can see, is that potentially what they would be doing is they're helping their brain to detoxify.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have a little bit of symptoms from that process, right?
That is so cool. Oh man. So this, I just want to insert something really fast. That just made me think about, are you familiar with fatal familial insomnia, the hereditary disease? It's an inherited disease that disrupts your REM cycle of sleep. And it's fatal. And there's, the last time I looked at the research, there's nothing to do about it. It's super rare. But basically, your cognition starts to decline and your body's function starts to decline only because you can't enter REM sleep.
Yeah.
So you can be given sleep aids to essentially just pass out, but your brain is not going into that REM sleep cycle. Yeah. And over time, you just deteriorate only because of that. And it just made me think of just how essential that sleep and then the lymphatic system and melatonin, all the things that play into that, how essential it is for healing your entire body.
Sleep is for restoration and rejuvenation. So if we do not get that rest period, and that's why sleep is, so many people have called it the new medicine, like how we need to focus on it because it primes the whole next day. And underneath that are all the other layers that we're talking about, and one of which is melatonin. Melatonin is in the darkness, kind of the cleanup hormone and helping with so many different body systems, not just in the autophagy and mitophagy, but also in synchronizing all of the peripheral clocks to the master circadian clock, right? It's like, it's getting you in alignment is what melatonin is doing at night, because we might be kind of scattered all through the day, but at night, it's like we come back to nature, we synchronize, we're clearing, we're cleansing, we're getting ready for the new day. And this is not rocket science. I mean, this is goodness. I mean, ancient traditions have known this.
Yeah.
But now we have a little bit more biochemical rationale and understanding of what's actually happening because of furthering the science of melatonin and the lymphatic fluid, looking at BDNF. You know, a lot of that is coming up more and more now.
I also just want to say to our listeners, like, we'll put show notes with like autophagy, mitophagy, BDN, like we'll give you some definitions so that you're not like, what?
What is she saying?
I actually just had this totally trippy Victoria thought where I was like, oh my God, like maybe the pyramids were these like dark retreat centers and then people would like stay in there and then come out to like have these, you know, like aligned events, you know, astrologically. Anyway, that's that's where my
now you're speaking my language.
Yeah, I'm just
so cool to think about.
Thinking, Dr. Minich, like when you if you want to come back and talk about more of like the trippy side of this, which I think is hilarious that these are like tryptamines, please come back and like talk to us about this. This is like what Hannah and I are secretly into. We like, you know, message each other alien memes all day, every day. So we're just pretending to be evidence-based. Yeah. I want to make sure that we get in this one last question, which is kind of like the biggest question that I've gotten is the supplemental melatonin suppressing our own endogenous production. And I know we've touched on this, but like, could you just kind of speak to that one more time before we close out?
Yeah. The quick answer is that we don't have evidence to suggest that taking exogenous or supplemental melatonin will stop the body's endogenous production of it. And also,
Mhm.
if you think through this a little bit, when people are nervous about taking melatonin, let's just say that they're 50 years old and they're like, oh my goodness, it's going to stop me from making melatonin. You're already not making a lot of melatonin. Just through age, you've tanked in your melatonin. So don't worry
Mhm.
too much because your pineal melatonin is already pretty low, right? But
Mhm.
again, the rationale and why people think this is because they're pigeonholing melatonin into a classic hormone, which has a positive feedback system and a negative feedback system, meaning that typically when something is triggered from the brain to produce a hormone, eventually there's enough of that compound or the molecule or some substance that goes and turns off that switch. That
Mhm.
doesn't seem to be the case with melatonin in this classic way. And if we look
Awesome.
at the decades of people in clinical trials, at least taking supplemental low dose melatonin, this does not seem to be reported as a phenomenon. And I have asked Dr. Russell Ryder, I've asked Dr. Tan, I've asked a lot of these melatonin gurus what their take, and they give me the same chuckle of like, yes, we've heard people asking about that, but essentially there is no direct evidence that taking low dose melatonin can stop the body's production of melatonin.
Mhm.
So, and there were even some prospective studies looking at that. Now, the one disclaimer to make around that is if somebody is taking double digit, triple digit doses of melatonin, there are some of my colleagues out there who think that if a little is good, more is better. Now, if you're taking high doses that have not been studied, I don't know what that will do. I don't
Right.
know if that saturates the receptors. Does that stop the signal? Is there some change in activity? This is why I always like to just stay physiological, just
Mhm.
patch the gap of what you don't have in middle age, right? Don't
Mhm.
try to aim for the stars and then overshoot on.
Literally.
Yes, exactly. I just don't think it works like that. So there just isn't a lot of, well, there is no data that I'm aware of high dose melatonin for extended periods of time and how that can alter receptor binding on the cell, can change
Mhm.
receptor activity, can change the actual function of melatonin. I don't think we know that.
Hannah, what do you think? Anything? We have
do.
1 minute.
I don't think we have enough time for all of my questions. If you ever want to come back on again and speak
Please.
more to this, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we come back and talk about the functions of melatonin a little bit more in depth because this was
Yes.
kind of like, we're all enamored with melatonin. We kind of just shared our love for it. But actually, there's a lot under the hood of what it is doing. And,
Mhm.
we could talk about, how do people know that they're low in melatonin?
Yes.
What do we think
Yeah.
about laboratory measurements of melatonin? I have opinions about all of that based on the paper and some of my other research. So, yeah, I'd be glad to come on and talk about that.
That would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
That's such important information for people to know and
Yeah.
have. And it's hard to find it as a consumer if you can't find that kind of information. So that would be incredible.
Yeah.
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me. It's been a delight to talk with both of you about our favorite topic here.